As your social media feeds have less and less things in them to do with Black Lives Matter, you might be wondering, are things going back to normal? And I hate to be the one to break it to you, my darling, but normal is dead. Normal is gone. That time is over. Change is coming. But change is going to be quite slow unless we all keep working. If we want to see change in our lifetime, we need to keep working to dismantle racism on all levels because, as you know, racism has been sewn into every fabric of our rich history and tapestry of society. So you may be wondering, what can you do to actually make change? Like, what meme or tweet can you post that's actually going to get the government to change? What can you say on your social media that gets the cops that killed Breonna Taylor arrested? And by the way, today would be a great day to arrest the cops who killed Breonna Taylor. And, I don't really have an easy answer for you. I don't know exactly what you can say that's going to get presidents and government officials to change their minds and change policies. But change has to happen on all levels. So we need to start right here with ourselves and work in our own communities. You might already be familiar with the comparison of racism like an iceberg, whereas the tip is things that are really obviously racist, like Nazis and the KKK and the killing of Black people and racial slurs. But below the surface, keeping those really obvious, blatant forms of racism afloat, are all these smaller, more passive, insidious forms of racism like unequal access to services and discrimination in the workplace and microaggressions. And a big part of that is something that exists in our communities a lot, and that is sexual racism. So what is sexual racism? Like any form of racism, it's complex and there's many different forms, but the three basic forms of sexual racism are creating a hierarchy of sexual viability based on race, stereotyping and assuming things about people's sexuality based on their race, and fetishizing people for their race. Number one, creating a hierarchy of sexual and dating viability based on race. That's probably the most blatant form of sexual racism, and let me tell you, it is very much a big problem in the gay community, the queer community, but it's a big problem among all people, especially here in the West. There was a bit of a drama recently where Grindr, the gay dating sex app, said that they were going to remove their ethnicity filter, which is actually a thing. You can select which ethnicities you want to see on it, and they have yet to actually remove that. I mean, them removing that is not going to remove sexual racism, but the fact that it's an option is illustrative of what I'm talking about. The way this hierarchy system works is usually people discredit an entire group of people as being viable to date or have sex with based on their race. And it comes in the form of people saying that it's just a racial preference. Oh, it's just my preference. I'm just not that into Asian features. Or, I just don't find Black guys attractive. Or, Latinx girls are too much for me. And these things, seem like just harmless preferences, but we need to examine where these preferences came from. We need to look back on what we consumed our whole life that made us think that we can discredit an entire group of people based on their race, because that's not a preference, honey. That is racism. So if we look back on the media we consumed, especially us in the West, we watched movies and read magazines and saw television shows, and what did we see in all those forms of media? We saw lots and lots of beautiful white faces. We saw so many Eurocentric faces and Western ideals of beauty that, yes, some of it was brainwashed into us so that we find whiteness to be the epitome of beauty. Unfortunately, that is the way a lot of us were brainwashed, but that is not to say that you have to remain that way. It's your job to review what you've consumed in your life, think about the way that it's affected you and your preferences, and it's your job to disrupt that and then dismantle it. Number two, stereotyping people based on their race. This is when you make big assumptions about the way people will engage sexually or romantically based on their race. And this too comes from the media that we consumed. And in especially the gay community, it comes out in really quite obvious ways in the way that people assume what you will be into sexually based on your race. There's a lot of assumptions made that Asians will be passive and submissive and are all bottoms. There's an assumption that Black men are all dominant, aggressive, and have BBCs. There's a lot of assumptions about Latinx people as being sexy poppies and daddies. And all of these things, might have morsels of truth and might be true for some people, but like with anything, it's so much more complex than that. And making these big assumptions and applying these broad brushstrokes to an entire race of people is a form of racism. I'm sorry to have to tell you, it is racism. Number 3, fetishizing people for their race. And this is where it gets pretty tricky, because a lot of the time the person doing the fetishizing thinks that they are being complimentary, because after all, they are attracted to someone of a different race. And how could that be racism? But it gets tricky and mucky when people talk about others of another race like objects, when they're attracted to another person because of their race, because of the stereotypes and assumptions they're making about their race, as opposed to being attracted to an individual with uniqueness and their own life story. This form of fetishization in sexual racism sometimes comes in quite small, seemingly harmless compliments like, "Oh, well, aren't you exotic?" Which I know I've heard 1.2 billion times. And that is complicated and fetishizing because it implies that the person is from a faraway place, from some nondescript, far-off land. So exotic, ooh. When a lot of the time the person being described as exotic lives in the West or even grew up in the West like me. So if I grew up in the West and you grew up in the West, how am I exotic? What do you really mean by exotic? Do you mean that I don't look white? I don't look like the white dominant majority? In that case, what you should say is, "Ooh, well, don't you not look white?" And that would be more accurate, and that kind of reveals how this is a racial issue. Fetishization also comes in kind of more blatant objectification modes of, "Ooh, I'm looking for a BBC," or "I want a sexy poppy," or "I want like a smooth Asian bottom." You're not looking for a person. You're looking for a physical feature, a stereotype of that person. You're not attracted to these individuals for being themselves. You're attracted to the idea of their racial stereotype. That's fetishization. And what that does is creates more of an othering. By painting and applying these stereotypes to someone, even if you find it attractive, you are othering that person. You are forcing them into a box. So even if you're like, "Ooh, I'm really into a race," that too is problematic. Saying I'm not into a specific race is racism, but also saying, "Oh, I am into a specific race," has its problems too. We should be into people, human beings, for all their complexity and uniqueness. So what can we do to challenge sexual racism? Well, you have to do a lot of work on yourself. You need to look at what you consumed growing up. Think about your favorite TV shows and movies. Think about the magazines you looked at. Think about every billboard you ever saw. And think about what was drilled into your head and brainwashed into your head as beauty. And then look at what you look at on the internet. Think about the pornography you consume. Think about your social media feeds. Did those people look a lot like the same white faces that you saw growing up? Are you just continuing to brainwash yourself? Because something I did a few years ago that's helped me on the road to trying to break down some of this awful racism that's been drilled into my brain is looking at my social media feed and giving it an overhaul, removing the basic attractive white faces from my feed, unless I know them, of course. My friends that are attractive and white can stay. But if I don't know you and you're just some random attractive white person monetizing your social media because you fit into the box of what is considered attractive by society standards, I don't need to see that. Do you know what I need to see more of? I need to see more beautiful people of color in my feeds. I need to see a variety of facial features outside of the Caucasian features. I need to see Asian, Latinx, Muslim, South Asian, East Asian. I need to see Black faces, black bodies on my feed, because the more I see them, the more beauty I see in them. And I'm able to slowly but surely appreciate more and more beauty outside of whiteness. Besides doing the work on yourself and trying to reprogram your own brain, you also need to disseminate that information to the people around you. And on occasion, you need to call that racism out. But if you hear someone discrediting an entire group based on their race, like, I could date a black guy, but I would never want to marry one. You need to engage that person in a conversation. Be like, why is that? Where did that come from? What media did you consume? What stereotypes do you believe that makes that true for you? Because that's racism. You also need to be willing to challenge someone when they seem to be complimenting a race, but in a fetishizing way. By assuming stereotypes about an entire race, we are only furthering boxing and othering us all. You need to be willing to engage in those conversations as well, because chances are the person that you're talking to doesn't realize the extent at which they were brainwashed. I mean, we were all brainwashed in the West, and we need to do the work on ourselves and our communities to make that change. Because as I said, racism exists in every single fabric of the entire tapestry of our history and society. And so in our communities, when it comes to sex and dating, we have the power to change ourselves and make change around us. Anywhere that you can be making change to racism is a good thing. And why not start with sexual racism?